This is a piece of research with two colleagues, Yamato Mori and Johan Ruelak. And the title of this is a bit bizarre, looking up like this. The title of this paper is called The Use of Tax Havens by Multinationals in the UK and the Global Financial Crisis. Now, normally when I present my work, I present it in front of an audience of IB scholars. So I'm trying to take this issue to IB. It's really quite tough. I find it really bizarre when you go to those conferences. They just don't talk about tax. It's really quite frustrating. So some of my slides today, you'll see, they're actually sort of designed for that type of audience in mind. Okay, so I don't want to. Some of the stuff on there to you guys, this is commonplace. You know all about this. But these are the sorts of stories that I have to tell to these types of audiences. Okay, so what's this all about? So clearly, the use of tax havens by multinationals in recent years has received a huge amount of hostility, and the fact that there are so many people at this conference this year, it just essentially attests to that. So the focus of the paper is to analyse how UK-based MNEs have reacted to this growing opposition since the crisis, essentially. And our focus is going to be on two specific channels which we think are interesting and important, and that is the role of the media and the role of austerity. I'm conscious of the fact that this is the penultimate session of the conference and everybody's a little bit tired. This is an econometric study, so I will go quick and try not to bore the life out of you. This does build on previous research that I've published using a similar approach. Okay, so it's really quite easy to motivate this paper. You just tell a story about what's happened to the British economy over the last 8 or so years, 10 to 8 years. Talk about GDP per capita being not returning to its pre-crisis level. Talk about the debt to GDP ratio exploding to nearly 90%, and austerity and all of that sort of stuff. And so it's therefore not really that surprising that you get all of these media stories in the press. And obviously our politicians react to this sort of thing. And we'd like to use a quote from our former Prime Minister. Okay, so the next part of the paper, so once I've motivated the paper, the next part of the paper then sort of tells a story of UK corporate tax policy and also international corporate tax policy. And I sort of make the argument that there seems to be a contradiction in my view. I'd be interested in your thoughts on this. Because at the same time that our politicians, George Osborne and so on, were going around the world pontificating about what multinational firms were doing in respect to their tax affairs, the UK enacted various policies that make it look a little bit more like a tax haven. So the corporate tax rate has fallen significantly. We had the introduction of patent box, various things. And then they really did seem to hammer into HMRC's budget. And there's a graph there of some of the data that I use in this paper. You can see the HMRC headcount falling dramatically as HMRC was restructured. Okay, so I have a little bit about international corporate tax, but I'm not going to insult your intelligence on this. You guys know a lot about this. Okay, so two other interesting graphs that are going to be quite useful for this paper. The graph on the left reflects some data from the data that tells a story of the data that we use. So we use Orbis data, which people have talked about today. And we get a set of approximately 6,500 UK MNEs. And we look at the percentage of them that seem to be using a tax haven subsidiary over time. And what we see is that there's been a bit of a growth over this time period, contrary to what you may expect. I don't know. And then on the right, we get some data on the number of media stories that involve the term tax haven, either in the headline or headline in the leading paragraph, or there's a minimum 3 occurrences of the term tax haven. And what you can see is there's not a lot going on prior to the financial crisis. There's a spike, and then there's a drop off. And I think my explanation for that is actually the policy response. There's a stimulus package to the British economy, after the financial crisis that actually worked quite well, okay? And the economy did start to recover. But then we see austerity start to kick in, and then obviously there's a reaction to that. With austerity, we see more and more stories about the use of tax havens. So, okay, so I'm an academic, and when I go to academic papers and publish go to academic conferences and publish academic papers, I have to have a theoretical side. I've noticed that a lot of the papers we haven't seen today don't really have this sort of stuff. So I generate a few testable hypotheses. The first hypothesis, the first two hypotheses, look at the role of media on tax haven use. And we have two, sort of, they're the flip sides of one another. So the first thing is you would expect that media intensity, what impact does that have on firms? Does it stop them from utilising tax haven subsidiaries? Or actually, quite paradoxically, and this is what we actually find it works in reverse. It might be the case that more media stories there are actually encourages firms to do this more. It might be that the media stories are just specifically targeted on some of the big firms, Google, Facebook, Starbucks, and so on. But everybody else sort of gets away with it. Maybe the media campaign isn't strong enough to impact upon firms. Welcome your comments on this. And then the other hypothesis relates to the HMRC headcount. What impact has the reduction in the headcount had on tax haven use by UK firms, MNEs? So we have an econometric model here, a couple of equations there. I think I'm the first to put some equations into this room. So I'm proud of that. I think you're going to do some in a minute?
I'll have one.
You'll have one. Okay, brilliant, exciting. So we have two models here. The first one is a sort of we call it a dichotomous model where we say an MNE has a tax haven, is classified as having an investment in a tax haven if it has a subsidiary in a location which we define as a tax haven. Okay, and the second specification uses the number of tax haven subsidiaries, and this sort of builds on a piece of work we did a couple of years ago with Alex on the Big Four, and the way we use the financial secrecy index to define what location is a tax haven. Okay, so that's the Y variable, so to speak, and then we're going to regress that on a couple of other variables, HMRC headcount and the number of media articles. We use a battery of control variables. We use lots of sophisticated econometric specifications, like we do something clever using a fixed effects model where we can control for sort of time invariant firm-specific effects. So the paper's got lots of robustness checks. As I said earlier, the data is from Orbis. We have approximately 30,000 firm year observations from 2006 to 2013. HMRC data is from the ONS, and the media data is from LexisNexis. Okay, there's a regression table, but I'll move on. Okay, what do we find? I think the two bullet points in green are interesting because these show our elasticities. So first thing about the tax inspectors, we find that an extra 1,000 tax inspectors reduces the probability of using an offshore tax haven by 0.2%. So obviously over this period, the HMRC headcount fell by 15,000. So that we think that that's quite a significant effect. Seems obvious, doesn't it? More tax inspectors, less tax avoidance. We're trying to show this with some data. And then the second thing, and I think we need to check this a little bit because the effect's quite high. What we find is an extra 100 media articles that include the term tax haven actually increases the incidence of tax haven usage by 5%. That's quite controversial. Okay. Discussions and limitations. This is a big study. There's lots of firms. There's no doubt some people have put some questions on the thing for us. So we think the UK context is pretty interesting because MNEs in the UK have faced quite a lot of hostility. The policy response of politicians has been quite slow and contradictory. Our findings about media seem somewhat counterintuitive, and perhaps there's an avenue for future research in that domain. There are some limitations significant limitations on this. Orbis data isn't perfect. We just look at where firms have got subsidiaries. We don't actually know the monetary flows that flow between subsidiaries and the parent and so on. What else? The HMRC headcount doesn't necessarily account for the restructuring in HMRC. So there are some limitations. It's not easy to do this sort of work, but we think we've got some interesting results, so welcome comments. That's it. Thanks.